Hello, this is Devo's Straight Dope again. This is Devin, aka Devo. Okay, so for those who haven't been paying attention to international affairs, there was a news report last week about how the South African Parliament had officially declared a policy that the country would take away all land from white landowners or the white farmers. And of course, there are strong sentiments for and against those sentiments. On the one hand, you have people who like the majority of the country who have been known as the Bantus. You know, these are the African nations and ethnic groups that have been placed in townships that were the victims of apartheid. They were always threatened to have their culture taken from them, like when the law came that all education, all classes must use Afrikaans as the language of instruction. There have been massacres. People can't travel certain parts of the country without the pass cards. And then on top of that, you would have about 80% of the population living in poor conditions in less than, say, 10, 15, 20% of the land. On the one hand, you have those who had benefited from apartheid. The minority, one of the smaller minorities, and that would be the whites, mostly the Boers, who are of, say, a Dutch, French, sometimes German, sometimes English, like Creole mixture, but they're like, the majority of their blood is Dutch, and their language, the language of the Boer, which is Afrikaans, is actually it was originally like 17th century Dutch. And so they're like 10% of the population or less, and yet they've had control of over 70% of the land by like their houses, mansions, and of course farms. So you have those who I would say have been frustrated and, dare I say, bitter of the fact that even after about 24 years of democracy in which the Bantus have the vote, the economics, businesses and of course land, are still in European descent hands. So I can see why they feel that way, but there's another perspective, and there are those where the only crime they committed was being born of Euro-South African heritage. The Boers especially, those who are of other European groups, those who are English, but the majority of the landowners are the Boers. the farmers, that is. In fact, Boer, B-O-E-R, is actually Afrikaans and I think Dutch for farmer. So what you have is they were born into this, they grew up into this, and many of them have had tolerant parents who eagerly welcomed the new South Africa. Those who were against apartheid, those who treated the Bantus more or less fairly, and because of that one crime of being born into a group that apartheid was actually created for, they're being punished by having their livelihood taken from them. Even though, if you look at other news reports from the last 10 years, you hear reports about farmers being murdered on their own land. And then, like, you would have them being murdered, tortured, raped, and so forth. And so maybe these crimes committed against them were based on maybe one person accusing them of cheating them, or just, I think that was what happened to F.W. de Klerk's ex-wife, Marika de Klerk. For those who know South African politics, if I'm wrong, please comment and tell me so. So, you have those who were born into a country where they're being told by their fellow South Africans, white, Bantu, colored, Asian, whatever, that they are the bad guys, and then they grow up in a society where people feel justified about taking land from them. Something that Nelson Mandela was vehemently against. He said, there's anything he taught is that this is not the time for revenge. This is the time for building bridges, for reconciliation. This is the time for forgiveness. Which is why, when it was his first day as president, and he noticed that some people either left or were preparing to leave, if they respected what he had in store for South Africa, he welcomed them to stay. He welcomed them to stay. And he had even, because of the type of noble, regal character he had, he even gained the respect of his jailers, of those who kept him in prison, moved him around. He gained their respect to the point where when he was being released from prison, their departure was emotional. So that's the other side of it. And now, before I get to my side, I want to tell you a story. And it's a true story. It deals with me. I was a student at North Park University, and I was in a sociology class. There were these two girls who sat next to me in the late Frank Steinhardt's Foundations of Sociology class. On one side was a Swedish foreign exchange student named Susanna Borgesen. And then on the other side was someone named Blanche Kieser. And I knew that Kieser was a somewhat Germanic name. I know it was not a Scandinavian name because of how it sounded. She had, while Susanna looked like your typical, stereotypical Swede, blonde hair, blue eyes, kind of tall, and yes, cute. Hey, I was a young college man, so yes. But we made good friends because I'll leave it at that. And on the other side, there was Blanche, who had brown eyes and short, dark brown hair. And so, but I noticed she had a bit of an accent. It was different from any I've ever heard before. It almost sounded English, but then she pronounced certain things differently, and then the way she spoke, it was very choppy. So one day, I had said to her, "Say, Blanche, I noticed your accent. You mind if I ask you where you're from?" And she's like, "Oh, sure, I'm from South Africa." The second she said, "I'm from South Africa," this alarm went off in my head, where I automatically knew from then that she must have been a Boer. And so I remember after that, as soon as she told me she was South African, and I knew she was most likely a Boer, then I started thinking about, I'm embarrassed to admit, I started thinking about apartheid and how people said that Boers were actually twice as prejudiced and twice as ignorant as your typical white Mississippian. So I remember for most of that semester, I would just observe her and I would say to myself, now let's see how long it takes before she says something ignorant, before she says something racist. And I waited and waited and waited. She never did. Blanche she is a genuinely sweet Christian woman, very polite, very nice, willing to help. And long story short, she put me to shame. And Blanche, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And I hope you understand where I was coming from then, and I hope, especially considering what's going on in your country, that you can accept my apology for how I felt back then. So, after a while I noticed, she was truly a sincere person, and so of course I felt embarrassed with myself because this time I was the prejudiced one. So after that, that's my little story to get into my point. And the point is this. Right now, South Africa is probably the richest country of the entire continent of Africa. And that's because of the many natural resources that South Africa has. South Africa is known for its gold. It probably The country probably has diamonds and other natural resources. And then on top of that, South Africa is still an important focal point for cargo ships on these going around the South Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. In fact, that's what made them, from this one refreshment stop, as one would say, that began with Jan van Riebeck in 1652, into a rich country, because not only did this country become rich from, not only did it become rich from the natural resources, but also with their trade, with their maritime trade, as it were, of cargo ships passing through. And then, of course, you can say that the country had also gotten rich by exploiting the natives and by bringing people from India over as slaves or cheap workers. And, well, to that, I mean, same's true for America. Same's true for probably Brazil, probably a lot of countries, but I digress. So, you have this rich country, but you know what other country was rich and had a lot of farmers? Zimbabwe, or what was known as the British colony, Rhodesia. Now, what happened was, when the natives of Zimbabwe had declared their independence from okay, you have this one truck driver, license plate 434-700D, that just cut me off, didn't even signal, but I digress again. So, basically what happened is, these countries, when they drove the British government out, then you had those who were born in Zimbabwe, in Uganda, but the thing is, these people who stayed, they stayed because they had farms, they had ranches, they had plantations, and because their families' lifeblood were in the land, they weren't just going to leave with the government. They were going to stay on their land. But the people and the government of Zimbabwe were not having it. So what they did was, the white British farmers who stayed on their land after the government left, basically once the government left and the people did not go too, they had little to no protection. And as a result, you would have people doing what some have done on farms in South Africa. You know, invading these farms, attacking the landowners, torturing them, killing them, and, you know, stealing trifles, and then leaving, or maybe even burning down some crops. And after a while, when the other farmers realized that the Zimbabwean government was not going to help them, they basically left, but they took their riches with them. Their accumulated wealth from the land, that their ancestors were not from. They felt right in taking the wealth from their land with them, and basically the land that was left over or became desolate. Or even worse, you would have those who refused to leave and decided to fight it out. And because of all of the tussling going on, because of that, much of the land was deemed useless anyway, and it would have been the same as what the British did to Boer land in the Anglo-Boer War. They poisoned the wells and salted the fields, so that basically making sure that nothing could grow there for at least a generation. So, and then when it comes to Uganda, when the British left and the British government, there was another group that was there where they originally came there to work as cheap labor for digging the mines and plowing the fields, and that would be the people from India. So when the British left, then you have this buffer ethnic group, the Indians, and when they had risen from generations of servitude, when they had risen from generations of servitude, what happened was they became wealthy themselves. And the dictator of Uganda, who came to power, Idi Amin, basically said, you have these people who are not from here. They're not black Ugandans. And yet, they are getting rich from us and our land, and yet treating us like one of their Dalits back in India. Because basically, if you look at the Indian caste system, which is not just a Hindu thing, but it has carried on into the Christian and even Muslim communities. I don't know about the Jainists or the Sikhs. If you really look at it, those who were in the higher classes, or the highest class, the Brahmins, they're very pale-skinned individuals, and they almost look like they're from maybe France or even Italy or someplace like that. Whereas those who are the Dalits are usually really dark-skinned, to the point of even being black-skinned, darker than me. And so they take the poor state of the black Ugandans and they basically say, well, you're poor, you're really dark-skinned, hence you are beneath us. And while many treated them equally with their Indian brothers and sisters, some really did treat them like they were soiled. And so as a result, Idi Amin, he basically took the discrimination of a few and made all Indians suffer, basically taking away their land and telling them they had to leave Uganda. And not just some, but all Indians were forced to leave Uganda. And they were given a deadline to leave. But as a result of basically driving people out wholesale like that, both countries became very poor. And that's why, looking at it from a practical side, that is exactly what's going to happen. Exactly what's going to happen if, I'm sorry, I get brain fog. That's exactly what's going to happen to South Africa if you just take away all of the land from the Boers and the white South Africans like that, just indiscriminately. And I know that there are some people who still live in South Africa who would seem to almost justify this new South African law, like with Peter du Toit, who began that whites-only community for the separatist cult in a town that ironically is now integrated, which is Owendale. And there are a few others where they've started these whites-only communities, whites-only communes. So I can see how those in Parliament would be in favor of this, and maybe they're just answering to the hysteria of the people. But still, for every person you are rightfully punishing for their ignorance, you are wrongfully punishing at least 5 other people who actually have been of great help and of great use to all of South Africa, especially the Bantu, or those who simply can't help who they were born to, can't help what their ethnicity is. You know, people like Blanche Kieser. So, and that's the moral perspective. You're driving away a lot of good people, and you're basically being vengeful to the point where it's almost like, well, not almost, it's like you're paying them back for what happened to your people. And I'll just put it to you this way. In about 24 years of freedom and democracy, how many times has a policeman beaten a group of protesters with sjamboks? In 24 years, how many have massacred teenagers and children? How many in these 24 years have been imprisoned as children and tortured and threatened? The answer is little to none. So then basically, if that's the case, how can you truly call this even revenge, considering that all that South Africa was changed and has not changed back in 24 years. Or maybe I'm missing something. So here's my solution. Well, first of all, repeal that ridiculous policy. I'm sorry, but it is ridiculous. That's the first thing. Second, if you're really worried about, because I know that still the majority of the businesses, the majority of the land are still in Boer hands, then basically you might want to try using some American politics. And we Americans like to talk about tax breaks for the rich, for the poor, whatever. So how about this? If a landowner has all of his land and is doing very well, either increase their tax, you can increase their taxes, or if they agree to sell some of their land, then basically give them a tax break. Or even better, let's say you have a landowner whose land is about to foreclose. They're about to lose their land. How about, as a condition for keeping the land and for having the debt forgiven, they must give up, say, maybe a portion of their land to the government, and then the government can use it to make better affordable housing. So you've got a lot of options. Tax breaks for selling land, or tax forgiveness for giving up land, or loan forgiveness for giving up land. So instead of punishing those with land, how about encouraging them to share some of that land? For instance, if you read the Bible, it says in, I believe in either the book of Exodus or Deuteronomy, where if you have an orchard or if you have a field, do not harvest or till the four edges of that field, but let them grow wildly. And this is why. So that if a stranger or if a stranded Hebrew should walk by, and they can take food from those corners and they can eat. So you're basically sharing for the good of all. So South Africa, you've got a beautiful country. I'd like to visit one day. I know you've got some problems. Well, we Americans have our problems too. Most countries have their problems, but why add to your problems? Let them keep their land. And don't undo the work that Mandela went to prison for, suffered for, struggled for. Don't undo his efforts. He wanted a rainbow nation, and those who voted for him knew that. Those who kept shouting Viva Mandela at their protests, they did that knowing that while he wanted his people to have rights, while he wanted to get rid of apartheid so that their cultures could flourish like they did before Van Riebeeck ever came to South Africa, he also realized that far too many were born here. and could be very useful to the country, and that in that rainbow nation that he created, they are part of that rainbow nation. And I'm going to close with this. It's a semi-rhetorical question. If you take the color indigo from a rainbow, is it still a rainbow? Think it over.